Okay, so we're all set.
Awesome. You recording?
Yeah, I can.
Great. Cool. So thank you all for coming. It's pretty awesome to get to talk to some devs about CSS. I think this will be fun. Hopefully I don't say anything super wrong. You guys can definitely call me out if I do. If you know something better than I do, that I would appreciate the clarification. So for those of you who haven't met me, my name's Will. I lead up our design department here. And, thinking about what to talk about today, I was thinking like, oh, we work with designers a lot, maybe like what it's like to work with designers or our design process. But, through my career, I've learned a fair bit about CSS, and I know it's something I get a lot of questions about. And I thought that was a little bit beefier of a topic for a TED Talk or a tech talk. So I guess for starters, I just want to kind of talk about my background a little bit, just so you know more about me and where I'm coming from. Uh, in college, I did news reporting, and that's kind of what I started doing. And I was really terrible at it. Couldn't read my notes after I wrote them, like the day after from interviews and stuff. So I then went into copy editing and did that for a while. That was like editing articles, writing headlines, that kind of thing. And eventually that led to print design, like doing page layouts and stuff. And as I started doing my portfolio sites and those sorts of things, I started learning CSS and HTML, and then wanted to do side projects that were totally code related for like journalism stuff in school. And there's this really good article on front end development called The Great Divide from CSS Rex. It kind of talks about this state of front end development and how you kind of have two sides of the coin. On the one hand, you have people like Gary and Aaron and the rest of the front end team who are really focused on kind of like heavy JS framework stuff. They more identify as developers and as programmers, and that's how they think, just like you guys. And then on the other side, you have people like me that are more like kind of like web designer types that like, think a lot about HTML and CSS structure, and like the only JS they know is like jQuery. Like I'm not a Vue expert, so I wouldn't even say like a Vue intermediate person. So it's that's kind of the background I come from. I put this O'Reilly book on here because funny story about when I was learning how to code, I decided to go to Barnes and Noble and buy like some tutorials and stuff. And this was the book I picked out, which JavaScript, the definitive guide, is not great for like entry-level JS stuff. It was like talking about object-oriented things, and I didn't know like what a div was. So it was pretty, I found better ways to learn over time, but it's part of the process. So, what does this talk about? Obviously CSS. Not a TED Talk. My wife was confused about that. She thought I was doing some like motivational speaking or something, so we joked around a lot about that. But it is, about kind of the two big problems you have with CSS. One is visual, right? You get a mock-up from somebody and you're like, how the heck do I make this with CSS? I don't understand that. Or, how do I get this to go from down here to up here on a page? The other is architecture, right? It's this idea of, okay, I have this big application. How do I structure my CSS over it to make it easy to work with? And you're giving us motivation. I don't know about that. So, thinking about these problems, we're really going to focus on the latter. And, visual problems, I think, are important. We're going to talk about that. Here's, of course, the iconic meme that I would, be fired for if I didn't include in my presentation somewhere. So, visual problems are difficult. I'm not going to say that's easy stuff, but there's lots of tutorials out there, right? So if you want to learn how to use Flexbox or you want to learn how to use Grid, definitely do so, and learn that way, because there's smarter people than I have that have done good tutorials. But I think one thing that isn't talked about as much is CSS architecture, which is something with the size of our application we actually have to think about pretty deeply when we're changing things. This is from Philip Walton. I found this quote. I've read some of his work before, and he writes a lot about this. And he talks about these two problems and how architecture is actually a bigger one, because if you don't feel like you can safely refactor CSS or, work on it, it can actually bring features to a halt. If you can't figure out how to get something from here on the page to up here on the page, it's not ideal, but we can always iterate and we can figure it out, and it's a solvable thing. But if you get your CSS architecture in a bad place, just like with any code, it can be really hard to undo that once you start to go down that way. So, maybe CSS isn't complicated, but maybe poorly architected CSS is a little complicated. I'll say that. Like I've been in situations like the guy from Google where you don't really have great understanding of the code base, and that can be really really hard to deal with. So, and kind of some signs of that, maybe you all have experienced this before, hopefully not working on Brightcore, but if you have, that's okay too. You know, can I delete this? That's like the biggest question in CSS, right? You know, you see some CSS on a page, you think you've removed everything, but then you look at it and you're like, well, have I? Like, can I actually not break production? Maybe I'll just write some more styling somewhere else to overwrite this so I don't have to remove it. Like, that's a problem we want to avoid. We want to be removing code where possible. Also, just what does this styling do? You know, you open a page, you see some really general styling that could apply to lots of sections of the application. How do you know what it's doing? How do you know what it's responsible for? That kind of thing. And then finally, kind of related to what somebody posted on the thread for my tech talk, hey, this Z index isn't working. Maybe I'll just bump it up by some random amount and see if now it's working the way I want it to. So that's another kind of common sign that you might have some architectural issues that you need to be thinking about. A+ there. So, you know, one thing, like if you only take one thing away from this tech talk, I think that the important thing for me is I'm no programmer, but I've learned a little bit along the way. And I think one key to thinking about CSS is to not see it as something that's all that different in principle from other programming languages. So yes, it has some funky stuff. Yes, there's browsers you have to deal with. All that stuff is true. But I think there's also a lot of overlap in just terms of general programming best practices that apply to CSS that apply to other languages. The ones I'm going to kind of highlight and talk about today are separation of concerns, naming things clearly, thinking systematically. And of course, Googling everything as I think like a tried and true programming practice. So that also works pretty well when in doubt. So separation of concerns is the first one. So as you all know, CSS is global, right? So it's easy to have side effects. You know, I've seen applications where you have one big CSS file and literally like comments separate the sections that do different stuff. And it's very easy to write CSS that, you know, you think is scoped to one area, but it isn't. It has side effects, and that's not good. So most modern, you know, CSS writing techniques, and I'm speaking of SAS too. SCSS is a kind of a preprocessor, a variant of CSS that we use in Brightcore. Definitely an important concept if you aren't familiar with it to check out. But in SCSS, component-based code is really a best practice now. And this is how we style both Gen 2 and Gen 3. Now, caveat, asterisk, whatever, not the really old Gen 2 that you all know I'm talking about, like the older Visions page, the old AR page, you know, the pages that are MooTools based. Those used heavy ID-based styling and have some of these anti-patterns we're talking about. In other ways, they do some things okay. You know, you generally know what the styling is doing on those really old Gen 2 pages, but it's not very reusable, which is, you know, its own architectural problem. But in Gen 2 and Gen 3, we really try hard to capture things in component-based styling. So what does that mean? Components are essentially reusable pieces of UI code. So this is taken from our source code. You can see here we have this component file, alert.scss. So this is all the code we have for the alerts. That, you know, the little messages that pop up on pages giving you a warning or a success. Same here, we have one for displaying a progress bar. You know, that's like a simple progress bar, 0 to 100, that kind of shows how you're, you know, progressing on some, you know, task or whatever. And so this is kind of the first step to having good CSS architecture, because it's basically, instead of all this being in one file that anybody can kind of dump anything into, you have to make a conscious decision of, oh, I want to organize my styles in a certain way, and I want to make sure that I'm only adding, you know, styles that make sense for this component. But obviously, it doesn't really stop there. You have to also think about how your components are, you know, being written. You know, any styles can go into those files. Just because you make a file called photo or, you know, a progress bar doesn't mean that only progress bar stuff is going in there. So it's important to kind of have an approach to make sure that those files stay separated over time. And the way we do that is by using the BIM naming convention. I don't know. Let's do the little in the chat, like yes or no. Who's heard of BIM and block element modifier CSS writing? I should be able to see this, I think, right? Oh yeah, there we go. Oh, little, okay. You can use the, okay, cool. So it's mixed. That's okay. So yeah, so the idea of block element modifier is pretty simple. It's the idea that you have kind of three different things in a styling file. You have your block, which is the base, right? And just so you know, this is our media component. The media component is a really good example of reusable visual styling. You see it all the time in web design. The idea is you have some content that needs to go next to an image. So this isn't even our code, but GitHub uses this pattern here. They've got my name and my location flush next to my thumbnail. That's a media object. That's what this styling lets you do in a reusable way, so you don't have to write that styling 50 times. This is also a media object here. My thumbnail next to my name. You see this pattern a lot in web apps. And so we have this component to do that styling. And then in this component, we're using BIM styling to accomplish this. So the first part of BIM, the B, is the block. That's the base declaration that goes on this set of code. So you have this media class that's doing some display flexbox stuff. Then you have a few other properties. You have the media item, which in this case would be the image. And then you have the media body, which is the text. So, in a pretty typical situation, you'd have a div that would get this media class, and then you'd have a div inside it that would get the body, that would be the contents, the text. And then you'd have an image or a div with an image inside it that would get this class on it. And so what this allows you to do is, you can see here, instead of having, it's kind of just makes it so that if you add a class to this, everything kind of has to be namespaced with this media attribute. So at some point in time, we decided we needed to be able to align this image to the top. And that's where the last sort of bit of the BIM syntax comes in. You have your block here. These are called elements, and they're noted with the underscores. And then you have modifiers, which have the dashes. And that's ways to add variations to your styling when it's needed to accomplish something. Does that make sense so far? Oh, there's a pull feature. That's cool. I'll have to use that, Jamie. So if we kind of look at that, that's kind of the idea of naming things clearly. If you use BIM correctly and if you use BIM consistently, it's really easy to see, okay, if I've removed every L media class in the application, I instantly know I can get rid of that partial. It's not like you're basing it on, divs or HTML conventions or anything like that. Related to this concept, but a little bit different, is the idea that you need to think systematically when you're using CSS, just like any library. And so this is the Z-index example we were talking about. And one thing that we do in the app, that Fernando, that was a good one. It made me chuckle. So one thing we do in BriteCore is, instead of, and it's actually a concept, the CSS Tricks article talks about it, kind of taken from video games, where, it's really important to think systematically how you're coding things, and they use Z-index to make sure, to kind of create the illusion of 3D space in those old school top-down games. So one thing they do is they have different levels, and, they define them in one spot. And that's really what we're doing here at BriteCore. So, if you're working on Z-index and something isn't, behaving the way you think, it's all in one spot. So you can see that the header has the Z-index, and modals we want to appear above the header. So instead of just in the modal file giving the modal a slightly different Z-index and tweaking it until it works, it's actually all stored in one spot, so you can kind of see the relationships. Okay, if we have a toast, which is like a site-wide alert, it should appear above everything. If we have the modal overlay, which is, I think that's like something in Bootstrap, but it needs to appear above the actual modal box itself. And then we have the background, which appears under that. And then we have like the site contents. This one is actually one we added recently. I saw it putting together the tech talk, but this is probably a little bit of an anti-pattern right here. This is 94. Why is that 94? That seems kind of random. So that's one that, when you're doing this stuff, that things like that can sneak in, and it's good to always be vigilant of that and kind of ask, why is that, that amount? It seems kind of weird. So, this idea of thinking systematically, not just with Z-index, but with how your CSS is structured and how it's being handled is important, I think. You know, in addition to this, like taking these concepts, and Z-index was one example of this, but there's ways to apply these programming principles to CSS that get a little bit into the visual aspect of things, but I think is still kind of focused on architectural concerns. And the ones I'm going to kind of talk about are keeping specificity low, measuring stuff without pixels, avoiding magic numbers, and then using utility classes. So specificity in CSS is a concept. If you don't know about it, it is probably what I would say one of the hardest things to wrap your head around CSS and how it works. But it's really important. And it's really one of the biggest reasons people get into trouble with like writing CSS. And, you know, like if you've ever added an important tag to something to get something to work for styling, like that's what you're dealing with right here. So this is an article from Philip Walton as well, kind of talking about side effects in CSS, if you want to read more. But really the idea behind specificity is that depending on how you write your CSS rule, it can overwrite things that overwrite things that come after it. Because a key concept of CSS is that the later file, like if you have two styles next to each other, this style is going to take effect. Like the last thing in the file wins, unless this first declaration is written to be more specific. Super weird concept if you haven't heard of it, so I probably won't try and get into it too much. But one example of this, you know, this is so complicated that it has kind of led over time to some interesting techniques. This is one of my favorite to kind of think about specificity, which is the Star Wars scale. I don't know if you've all ever seen this, but you know, the important tag is like the Death Star, and then HTML selectors like a P and an anchor tag are stormtroopers. What's going to win between the Death Star and the stormtroopers? I think it's pretty obvious. But there's other cases where it gets really confusing. Like two class selectors isn't as specific as two HTML elements with two classes or IDs in classes, you know. So there's a lot of complexity here. And in the past, people writing CSS would try to like reason about this. I've looked at, you know, declarations before and I'm trying to like, oh, why is this style here getting overwritten by this one here? Okay, this is a little more specific. I have to do something different to account for that. And that really can lead to lots of problems. But that is the really nice part about the BIM techniques that I was showing you, because it really tries to, in many cases, in many cases, it tries to sidestep the issue of specificity altogether, right? Like you don't see a lot of HTML elements in these declarations. You don't see a lot of weird CSS rules. You don't see a lot of IDs. It's very much just straight up class names. And that really solves a lot of problems. And that's one reason why BIM is such a nice way to write CSS, I think. And one thing you notice too is that these class names are, whoops, I keep going back to this example. These class names are very namespaced and specific. So, you know, if we look at this code pin, this kind of represents a way that CSS was written kind of before BIM came along that was a little bit better than what the Star Wars was dealing with. You'll see here we have a title class for this article. We have this article component. We have this title class, and then we have this widget, and it has a title as well. So this is a pretty straightforward way to see some old school CSS written, right? Like, okay, my article title, I'm going to give it a bottom border. My widget title, I'm going to make it gray. But because of how you've structured these classes in the HTML, when you have a widget inside this article, not only does it get the gray color, but it also gets the article's border bottom. So that's what we call side effects and some of the kind of unintended consequences that poorly architected CSS can have, right? Doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but you were only thinking when you wrote this that the article title here would get this styling, but in fact, it's kind of leaked out of this one and it's now getting applied to this inner widget, but not the outer one. So that's kind of the advantage that BIM has. I mean, this looks awfully wordy, but that's the advantage of the namespacing. You know, in this pin here, well, where did my pin go? Oh, it's in the Miro board. In this pin here, if you had, you know, article, and then you had article underscore underscore title, and then widget underscore underscore title, that would essentially encapsulate that styling, and it would this wouldn't have the border under it, and it would look correct. So just kind of an example there of how that works. Like I said, though, there are some cases where you do want to kind of use this idea of specificity and the cascade in CSS. It's important to limit this usage overall, but as long as you're intentional with it, it can be handy. An example here that we'll talk more about is the idea of utility classes. So utilities are kind of these one-off things that maybe they make some text italic, or they make something red or whatever, but they just do that one thing. And when you add a utility class to an element, you always want it to look like that. So the way we do that is, this is in our design system in Gen 3, we always put utilities at the bottom of our files. So the cascade is already on our side here. We have all these components coming before it, and then the utilities comes last. And because we're using class names, everything has the same amount of specificity, and so the utilities basically are going to be the thing that take effect if you use them because they're coming last. So, when you're kind of ordering your files, that's something to think about with your architecture is, well, what do I want to, win if there is a conflict? And utilities are one case where you want to use that specificity to your advantage. So, and we'll talk more about what utility classes look like here in a little bit. But another kind of concept, this cracked me up. I don't know if anybody's actually ever done that. I hope not. But another concept that is important to kind of building CSS in a modern environment, and is this idea of, oh, hold on, whoops. Gary. So the idea of measuring without pixels is that, pixels are kind of they're useful in a few situations, but for most of the CSS that we write these days in BriteCore, we try to really leverage EMs, REMs, and then VH and VW units, with EMs and REMs being the most important ones. And the reason we do this is for kind of multiple reasons. It's a little bit more flexible, and it makes customization easier. So what are these units? It's kind of weird, right? If you've never seen these units, this will probably be kind of hard to wrap your head around. But the important thing to know about EMs is that they are relative. It's a font size measurement, right? So, or it's just a measurement for anything. So if you said width 1em, that's how you would write it. And it's relative to the parent's font size. We'll explain more about this in a second. I've got an example. So if you don't know what that means, it's okay. And then rems are relative to the root HTML element. So if we look at this code pin here, love that band. So if we look at this example here, we've got a few different boxes, right? The first one is the width is being, hard-coded in pixels. So this width is 160 pixels, and that's declared that way. The rem unit is given a width of 10 rems, and its current width is 160 as well. That's because the current HTML font size, so the font size of the root HTML element, is 16 pixels. So the rem is going to say, when you declare a rem, the browser interprets that, says, okay, this is measured in rems. I'm going to go look at the HTML element, see what font size it has, and apply that to this box. So that's how you get 160. That one's pretty straightforward. Ems, on the other hand, are a little tricky, but it's actually pretty cool, and they're probably the most powerful one, in my opinion, because they say that if something is declared in ems, it's going to go up to its parent, and then up a level above that, and up a level above that in the DOM to look for a font size being declared on something else. So this says 10 ems, and it's going to go up and look at its parent, which is this wrapper, and it has 1.5. This is going to look up to the next thing up, which is actually the HTML element. So the wrapper is going to say, okay, I need to be 1.5. The HTML element's 16 pixels, so my font size is going to be 24 pixels. Then this measurement in here is going to say, okay, 10 ems, what's the parent font size? Calculate to 24 pixels. Okay, I'm going to be 240. So you can see that what happens is if you change this a little bit to 20, the measurement has gone up to 200 pixels. The pixel one hasn't changed. It's static. It doesn't change ever in this situation. and the current width of the inbox has gone up to 300 because 1.5 times 20 is 30, then 10 times 30 is 300. So, okay, Will, that's a super fascinating code pen. What is the practical point of this? So if we look at a BriteCore S'more, we have all this styling in place. This is something we do in BriteCore right now. And so if I inspect it on the login page here and go up to the HTML element, actually I'm going to go with body for a couple reasons. Yep. So by default, we use 100% font size. So we try to honor what the whatever somebody wants to set in their own browser as their font size. But we've actually had carriers that say, you know, man, this text is so big, I have to scroll so much. I want BriteCore's text to be smaller. So we've actually had people that do that. And so you can set the HTML size to 14 pixels, and you'll notice everything just magically shrunk down. Like our boxes resize responsively, our buttons get smaller, the header got smaller. This allows us with just one variable to completely change how the app displays, and we don't have to rewrite, you know, hundreds of lines of CSS. And you know, if you had hard-coded pixel measurements for box widths and stuff like that, you would have to go and change all that. But if you're using rims and then EM units as well, you can actually update a lot of these things, and we can make it 20 pixels. Like let's say somebody's like, hey, our CEO has really bad eyesight. We actually want to make our BriteCore much larger. Like that's totally possible, and it's super responsive. I think maybe one that doesn't look as responsive is that button text. I don't think it's quite shrinking down the same. No, it's staying the same. So that might actually be a little bit of or there might be some hard-coded pixel measurement there that's setting that. But you get the idea. By and large, this is a pretty effective way to do kind of responsive, more flexible styling for your CSS versus writing a lot of hard-coded measurements. You know, if you're interested in more on this, this is a CSS Tricks article on rims and M's and kind of the strategy behind when to use one versus the other. It kind of talks about some of the same concepts that I just went over, but it goes into more detail for sure. So, this is one that we kind of, let's see here. How did you get that ruler to appear on the BriteCore login page? Okay, so let's see here. Bhargav, I don't know. Do you want to unmute? Describe what you mean, man. I'm kind of curious.
Oh yeah, when you open the dev tools on this page in the beginning, you see that on the top there.
Oh yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that. So if you do lots of front end stuff, definitely diving into the dev tools shortcuts is good.
Oh,
I think or settings is good. I think there's.
I saw the option in the middle at the very top.
Oh really?
Yeah. Yeah, on that page, on that settings page.
Oh, you saw it? Okay, let me go back there.
Show ruler.
Oh yeah, show rulers. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's one I've used that before. Another. This is getting a little off topic, I guess, but I did think about doing something on DevTools. This is really good color format. If you've ever, so we work with HSL colors in the design system. They're a lot more human readable, I think, than RGB or hex codes. So if you're just kind of, you know, messing around with something and you want to save a color, you know, somehow that we can reuse it, or anytime you have a color in one format and you want it to put it into another, you can actually say, I want colors to show as authored, or I want them to show only as RGB. And so if you're inspecting, that will force the inspector to always show colors in RGB format. You can also change that here by clicking around, which is handy. Also the eyedropper, that's amazing. I mean, just talking about stuff I like with DevTools, that's getting a little off topic, but trying to think if there's anything else. This one is really nice. Also for front-end related stuff. I mean, hot reloading and everything has made this a little less necessary, but I find it really handy to have this checked under the network tab. Disable cache while DevTools is open. Then if you've got the inspect panel open and you're refreshing the page to look at something you did, you always know the cache is cleared. You don't have to do the hard reload or anything. Let's see here. I think those are the main things I use on these. I don't know. If anybody else has DevTool tips, definitely throw them out in the chat or something. But yeah, good question. The rulers are really handy. I know this is one thing that Aaron mentioned the other day that he didn't know you could do. You can drag these around the DOM. So like if you're experimenting with something, you can just, you can drag stuff around. You can right click and edit as HTML. And, like I've developed stuff that I then like pay to developers that are working on the feature just right here in the DOM. It's really handy for little stuff. So sometimes if you want to get somebody some code and you want to see how it looks, just doing it in DevTools and then editing as HTML and pasting it out is pretty effective too. So anyways, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's just in Chrome too. Like is there any way to get the Sass variable color? That's a really good question. My understanding is that there are Sass code maps that you can do. I've never looked into how to do that, but it is possible. If you have code maps, you can like compile maps that basically tell the browser how to interpret things. And then I think if you have it hooked up right with your local environment, you can actually change variables in DevTools and it'll update your local instance with like the updated value or something like that. So maybe something the front end team could look into sometime to see if we could hook those up, because that would be cool. Yeah. Yeah, source maps, that's what it's called. So I'll drop that link too. Okay, so magic numbers, right. This is kind of something I was talking about with the Z-index example from Britecore, but magic numbers are this idea, and I'm sure this is a thing. I think I've heard this in other programming languages too, but in CSS, it's just this idea that sometimes you have measurements or you have, dimensions or values that for whatever reason you need, but that seem kind of mysterious, right? Like if you came back 6 months from now, you would have no idea why it's set to that. So, they tend to be pretty little. Like anytime you're kind of defining something very strictly in CSS as one thing, it's going to add in flexibility to your styling, but sometimes you have to use them. And, in those cases, it's good to add a comment. This is a really good example. Like, width, 1.8 rems. Well, why is that, being thrown on there? Okay, IE11 sidebar icons. Okay, so this was the new Gen 3 nav that we did, and that's a really good example of, if you feel like you have a measurement that will be kind of confusing, I'm a big fan of comments. I mean, I know comments can be kind of controversial. Oh, if you change the code, will you remember to update the comment? But I think in CSS, you don't have a, because it is more open and flexible and you don't have a lot of guardrails, that I think, an appropriate amount of comments are a good thing to help you maintain the code. So let's see here. And then finally, this is a concept we do use in Gen 2, and we're using even more in Gen 3. It's the idea of utility classes. I imagine most of you have some exposure to this. On the whole, it's becoming a more popular technique. Tailwind is probably the biggest example of this. Base CSS kind of inspired some of our utility classes as well. But it's the idea that you have these single responsibility classes to do stuff. This is actually a really good kind of example of how it does it, like text large, text purple makes it purple. So, some people will talk about using Tailwind, which is all these classes, it's a framework for using these to style their whole application. I give them lots of credit. I find there are some limitations to it, especially when you get into examples like this where you're dealing with responsive styles. When you're dealing with styles that get reused a lot, you have to remember the right combination of classes to put on there. I think they have some tooling around to help with that. But generally, I find utility classes and the way we use them to complement component classes. So if you're styling something and you need it to look a certain way, but it's not it doesn't merit its own component, or it's really something pretty small, utility classes can be really helpful for that. And, here's an example of of these. Probably the most well-known ones that if you all have used them, you probably have used these, are the spacing utility classes. These are actually taken from base CSS, which is, I think, pretty similar to Tailwind. But it's this idea that in the application, we have, what's a really good example here? Yeah, these are. So we have these different utility classes that if you add them, they will add different levels of spacing. So you can see here we've got one is, and you can see here we're using rims. So by default, this would be 4 pixels, and this is a fallback for IE, which doesn't support rim units always. But we have a quarter of a rim, half a rim, 1 rim, 2 rims, and then 3.5 rims. So here we're taking that and we're applying it to these classes. So if you do an MT1, what that's going to do is it's going to give margin top level 1, or basically 4 pixels of margin top to whatever you put that class on. And that's basically all a utility class is. It's doing one thing only, and you can apply multiple of them to an element. So maybe you need a little margin top, and then you want a little more margin right. You know, obviously if you use them together, because of how CSS works, only the higher one would take effect. But that's generally what a utility class does. And it's a really good way to, you know, find a compromise, right? Like if you needed components for everything, it would just really bog down the app and you would get components being created that probably don't need to be created. But if you let people just write any sort of spacing logic they wanted to, you would get some inconsistency. This actually kind of also enforces some consistency. Like, you know, if people are using level 2 throughout the app, it's going to be the same amount of spacing, which can kind of lead to a natural sort of better aesthetics in the application, because you don't have 6 pixels here, 8 pixels there, you know, 10 pixels somewhere else. It's much more standardized. Why are we using the pixel variant for margin spacing? Yeah, that's a good question. So, oh, I see what you're saying. So this is actually the way we do this is that we have the IE fallbacks all grouped together first, and then we have the regular ones here. It's kind of weird. You could have already, I guess you probably could have done this where you do the pixel fallback and then you do the IE one. But the way IE works is it'll actually read the pixel one, put that into effect, and then take the, you know, if it can support the rim units will override it because it comes later. If it can't support rim units, it'll just ignore the rim and it'll apply the spacing. So this is really just for, I think, IE. Oh, this is good. For those of you who have never used it, this is like the best site for CSS, like browser stuff ever. So can I use .com? So if we type in rim, it'll show you that, yeah, we basically added that for IE8, which I don't think is even supported anymore in Gen 2. So we could probably actually remove that fallback now. That's kind of a good note. But can I use is amazing. It shows you all the browser versions, you know, and what's supported on them. So Flexbox is, you know, a really common thing to use now. Oh, whoops. There we go. Flexible layout module. So it'll show you, like, you know, if there are issues with IE, you know, what the issues are and kind of how to work around them. So if you do have to deal with cross-browser stuff, Can I Use is a really good resource. So it even does stuff like not even CSS, like GP2. Yeah, so it'll show you, like, you know, DOM level stuff, like DOM API stuff, like voice, you know, is like the, or maybe the speech. Yeah, the speech recognition API, which is like the new thing to do like speech recognition in the browser. It'll show you support for it, you know, how to enable it if it's experimental. So Can I Use is a really great site, not just for CSS, but for anything kind of front-end HTML related. So, so good question. That's it. That's all I had. I know we're a little short, but I guess that leaves time for questions. I don't know, it can be about anything. So.
Yeah, so there was
Anybody
also
have anything?
lot. learned a ton of new things. So if you guys have questions now, you can turn on your mics and ask them directly.
Something be sure to ask how to vertically align something in CSS. Grant should know that is not that hard these days. So if you so 50 oh yeah, I think I did forget to talk about VH and VW units. So those are viewport units. Those are pretty cool because those are saying like if something is 50 VH, like a Camillo posted, it would say that it is half the height of the viewport, so half the height of the browser. So you can actually make something like that. So yeah, but yeah, so if you do have to vertically align something, which is like the classic, like, you know, whoops. That's the classic, you know, one of these, right? Really the best way to do that would be to use Flexbox. So if, I know you were just joking and Grant was just being a jerk, but if you actually are wondering, that's the best stuff. That's the best way to do it. You know, older techniques talk about like, you know, inline block and, you know, there's all sorts of hacky stuff, but Flexbox actually makes it pretty easy. Oh, this is cool. I've never seen this before. Oh, very cool. That's neat, Rohit. Thank you. Okay, so Fernando, yeah, of course. I'm glad you liked the talk. I'm happy to do it. It's cool. So question, so how do you guys see all these new frameworks like Vue.js, React, and Angular aiding all the CSS situation and hopefully automatically managing some of the patterns you guys maintain for BC? So that's a great question. One thing that, you know, Vue does let you do in a lot of the new components is you can have CSS in your component files, right? That's like one of the big advantages with React, and Vue is similar in that way. And that CSS will be scoped to those component files. Typically, we've actually avoided doing that. We've kind of kept CSS in its own dedicated files. The one situation that I will say about that, and it kind of gets in the weeds a little bit, but the biggest reason we do that is because and one of the hard things for me to wrap my head around as we think about Vue and CSS is that a Vue component isn't necessarily a CSS component or a UI component and vice versa. So like we have lots of Vue components in the app that really if you did CSS specific to that component, you would have the advantage that it wouldn't be affecting things outside of its concern, which is good. You know, so the side effects are limited, but the disadvantage is that a lot of times Vue components are very particular. A lot of times the Vue components are very particular to what they style. So like, okay, sorry, I'm just gonna dive into some Gen 3 stuff to kind of illustrate this because I think it probably will make more sense. So if you also have to work on Vue ever, there's the Vue Dev Tools, which is really good. So it just makes it a little bit clearer how everything works. Okay. Yeah, so this is a really good example of kind of what I'm getting at here with this distinction. So this is a line component in Vue, right? And you have all the logic to generate this kind of list of lines. It doesn't matter if you don't know anything about the lines module, but it's essentially the product in BriteCore that stores all our rating configurations for the new Gen 3 stuff. So this is a test, build of auto. You can see here we've got a driver, a vehicle, and this is going to be used to store the definitions for what gets created when you make a policy. Like, driver has all the data points that the system collects about a driver, and that's where they're defined and stuff. So there's this Vue component called line, but if we actually had styling in this line thing, that would kind of be as bad as the old days where you had page-specific styling. We really want our CSS, above all else, to describe the visual patterns that are being created and not the content that it's styling, because we want that styling to be reused. And if you had this line CSS and you were trying to reuse it in another part of the system, like claims, it wouldn't make any sense to see that class name there. So really a big piece of what we do with CSS is this idea that we are trying to describe the visual patterns, not necessarily the patterns in the front-end logic, if that makes sense. And the way we kind of do this is it all does kind of filter down eventually to a card component, which we do have styling for, but that card component is much more reusable in different parts of the system. So sometimes the view components, correlate one-to-one, other times they don't. So we really take an approach of keeping our styling separate to kind of make sure that we aren't adding CSS to the system that is kind of one-off. What do you think about CSS in JS from Gary? I mean, yeah, so CSS in JS, I mean, for those reasons, I mean, I think I'm probably like lean against it just because I think when it makes sense, it can work, but I think it can make it pretty hard to know, okay, well, should I be adding CSS to this JS file or not, or should I be adding it to in a more reusable place? So generally we avoid this in the new Gen 3 stuff, but yeah. So I'm not sure if I should be asking this here. How do you apply CSS to web components? That one, it's good to ask. It's a good question. I don't know. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that one? You can just talk. You don't have to use the chat.
So I once had to work with creating web components, but I had serious problems with getting my generic styles to be applied to individual web components.
Are these like web components like a true like web component spec or whatever, or were these like in React or something?
No. Actual web components, not Vue components or React.
Yeah, that's one I've never actually worked with those, so I don't know if other front-end guys has, but yeah, that one I'm not sure about.
Oh, okay, thank you.
That's a good question though. So in that case, I would do the Google everything approach, CSS applying to web. So I don't know. This is why I'd say like Google everything. I don't know if this would help or not, but you can maybe take a look at that and see if it makes sense for your situation. Maybe it doesn't, but it might help you some. So CSS tricks, I linked it a few times. It's a great resource, just in general. I don't know if this article will help you or not, might not, but it's a really good one for just learning about CSS and how some of the more hairy bits work. So yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question about the spacing. What you show us recently about spacing. This is in the BriteTalk UI project or in the VC design system?
So the spacing classes, we recently moved the utilities in Gen 3 to the design system, so they're there. But it's also in Gen 2 BriteCore. So if you ever have to work on Gen 2 BriteCore, it has spacing utilities as well. But in the design system, it's in the utilities file down here. It has a U namespace on it, but it's pretty similar.
Right. Yeah, I found some examples in the VC design system is that they have the like inline style in the HTML, and that maybe it's not simple just to copy the example and paste and make it work, because
if you see any inline styling, that definitely is a no-no. But it's one of those things that we, I mean, as you know, sometimes people do it and it's hard to catch going in, and then it's just one of those things. If you see it, it's good to like make an issue or just make a comment and try and patch it up. But I don't know. It's not always easy to catch that stuff when it goes in. So, but yeah, you're right. It does make it harder to copy and paste and do other stuff.
Yes. Yeah, what I see maybe that the VC design system, the examples are like not using the same style as we use in BriteTalk UI. So that is.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, sometimes tricky.
Yeah, that's fair.
I know that because it came from the Element UI, so it's hard to change all.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point, just so you all know about the design system. So for Gen 3, I don't know how many of you all know we have this. I mean, we've posted about it before in Slack, but Slack's kind of a hairy mess sometimes, and everybody's new. So so this is the design system site, and this is the design system we're using for Gen 3. So it's based on Element UI, which is what Facundo was talking about, which is a Vue.js, kind of UI kit. And we've built on top of it, and we've extended it some and kind of tweaked other things about it. But the public documentation site's up here. Pretty good resource if you're going to be working on Gen 3, or some teams are starting to, the front-end team recently has started a project to actually replace the Gen 2 accounts receivable screen with a version of the page that uses our design system. So it's not like a full rewrite, it's kind of like a UI refresh, but it uses this design system. So if you find yourself working on some of the newer stuff, this is a good resource for you as well. Daniel, that's a good question. So his question is SCSS variables versus native CSS variables. So yeah, this is one thing that CSS variables. One of the big advantages when Sass came out was that it allowed you to use variables, like that Z-index example where we were organizing Z-index by purpose and kind of all in one spot. That's not possible in CSS natively, or at least it wasn't for quite some time. I think partly because of the success of Sass and Bless and similar tools, Stylus, etc. CSS variables were added to the spec a year or two ago, maybe more than that ago, but they allow many of the same functionality. They also have some kind of cool features. So CSS variables will actually let you update things live in the site. So normally CSS or Sass files have to go through, they're a preprocessor, right? So they have to be, saved, and then they have a build step where they have to be compiled down into CSS. So it's sort of like a compiled language. With variables in CSS, it's actually pretty cool, but there is no compile step. So you can do awesome stuff, like you can actually access CSS variables in your JavaScript. So like if we wanted a page to like customize the UI of BriteCore, like we wanted to give clients a page that could do that, we could make like real-time updates to that page, based on how they pick a color or, how they change a font or something. So CSS variables are definitely powerful. I haven't looked into it a ton, in terms of would it be good to switch. They aren't supported on IE at all, which is a problem. Sass works pretty well, so it would be kind of a shift in how we do them. And I'm not sure that, while those applications are cool, like JavaScript access of them and stuff like that, it just doesn't really solve a ton of problems for us that Sass doesn't. So I think that's why we haven't switched. I have heard of techniques where you kind of have both Sass and CSS variables going, with like the Sass variables as a fallback, but it's just not something we've really prioritized too much. But it's a good question. Yep, because clients are able to override those SCSS variables already to do theming. It just can't happen in real time. It's got to have a build step every night as part of the like site release or whatever. So, I think if we were starting from scratch, like if I was the only designer and I got hired yesterday and it was all the old stuff, I would probably do CSS variables and, figure out how to make it work. And, but for now, Sass has worked pretty well. So. I don't know, Daniel, does that answer your question all right? If you know of some other advantages that would be like super awesome that we're missing out on, I'd love to hear more about it. Or if you've used them before yourself, that would be cool, because I don't have too much experience with them other than, kind of reading some articles and stuff.
No, you answered my question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. Anybody else have any other questions?
Last question. Is CSS complicated?
Yeah, probably. I went with the inflammatory title to get you all to attend and yell at me, but yeah, it is hard. But I think it's like, yeah, Python's complicated. Like everything's complicated. It's just, it's one of those things that what I don't want you to think is that it's like some mystery thing that's like impossible for any human to understand. It's like it's a little weird, but I think especially with these tools like CSS variables and Flexbox and Grid, I think it has become a lot more systematic over time. Like the days where you had float layouts and you had no idea, like literally it was really hard to understand. I think things are getting to, CSS I think is becoming more structured and more systematic, that it is actually easier to reason about in your head. So, which I think is, I think is kind of the takeaway for me. Like I think CSS 10 years ago was much harder to write than CSS today. So
yeah, and a lot of new tools to help us in the development.
yeah, exactly. And that, I know not working on the Gen 3 stuff, the design system and UI has its own complications and can be kind of hard as well. But, I think the basics of positioning and, architecting CSS that's easy for other people to work on is a little bit easier now than it used to be. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, man. Awesome. Well, if anybody doesn't have any other questions, I guess we can wrap. Thank you all for coming.
I think we're gonna wrap up.
Hope it was a useful talk.
Yeah.
Very useful. Thanks again.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Well, you did a good job, man.
Yeah, no problem.
Goodbye then.
There's something there for everyone.
I pasted the chat in the Miro board too, so that's not lost to the ages. So if you want to check out the Miro board real quick too before we go, it's right there. I'll post it in the Tech Talk channel as well. If you have questions or comments or articles, like I tried to put other articles on this thing that I think are useful. I'd never heard of this site, but this site actually, when I was looking at it just before the talk, HTML and CSS is hard. It had really good articles on just like basic visual concepts like I was talking about, like the box model and Flexbox that seemed really good. So if you have other stuff that you want to share out that you found helpful, just feel free to paste it here or leave comments, whatever. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Will.
Well,
Bye.
night, everybody.